The story begins with someone remembering an uncontrollable swordsman who liked to be stuck in his room. That swordsman was a man out of his mind. It was Count Perdium's useless son, Ghislaine Perdium, a name the person who was recalling those facts remembered very well. However, back to the present, that person, who was heavily wounded, couldn't believe that he, the best knight of the North, had been defeated by that garbage human being. In front of that knight was a man who was looking at him and at other warriors who were scattered on the floor. That man began to tease the knight, asking him if he thought that the trap the man had made by putting a lot of money was warm and cozy. The whole place was surrounded by fire as if a big explosion had just taken place, and the man, who wore armor and a helmet that hid his face, except for his eyes, asked the knight if he liked the result. Of course, the knight was pissed after hearing that and quickly said that the man in front of him was none other than Ghislaine, that garbage. The knight also couldn't believe that the man had set him up, because that would mean that he knew of his plans beforehand. The man then confirmed that not only he knew of the knight's plans beforehand, but the man also knew how many of them there were, who were the spies, and who had helped the knight with reinforcements. In short, the man had known it all from the start. However, the knight still couldn't believe those words. After all, he had always been a hidden ace card. So how could a useless piece of shit like the man in front of him dare to say that? Nevertheless, before the knight could finish that sentence, the man kicked him in the face while ordering him to shut up. The man then took off his helmet and added that they could try invading however many times they wanted, but he was going to be the one to win the war the next time, and the next time after that, every single time. Afterward, Ghislaine, who was leisurely showing his face, said that he would win every time because he had gotten all the plans. A flashback then began, taking us a year before those events. The place was the Luthania kingdom, near the Perdium estate. There in an encampment, our protagonist suddenly woke up wondering what had just happened, and if he was alive. He couldn't believe he had survived, because just a while before he had been killed by another knight on a bloody battlefield. The killer had been one of the continent's top 7, a man called Noble Knight Idun. Once our protagonist fell on his knees, Idun told him that that was the way how it ended. That was the end of the road for Ghislaine Perdium, the mercenary king, and another of the continent's 7 strongest men. Idun then added that the war was over, and asked the other if he had any last words, to which our protagonist replied that he had none. It was just a shame that he had been unable to fulfill his revenge. Ghislaine then yelled at the other that he was a sickening bastard, and that he should die. After hearing that, Idun called our protagonist arrogant, and said that he hadn't expected him to have been the oldest son of the fallen Perdium household. He even dared to ask if Ghislaine had left the family after the death of his sister. Nevertheless, our protagonist didn't fail to catch some interesting information in those words, and asked Idun how he knew that when he was from a different kingdom, to which the noble knight replied that of course he would know. After all, he had worked his ass off long before, trying to track Ghislaine down, because they were the ones who had worked with the Delphin household to bring down our protagonist's family. Of course, those words shocked Ghislaine, but before reacting he tried to understand the implications of what the other had said. It seemed that there had been other people behind his family's demise besides Duke Delphin's household. Ghislaine was pulled out of his reverie by Idun, who said there was no point in explaining it further, since the other was going to be dead soon. In that situation, our protagonist's only path was to accept his fate. That triggered Ghislaine's rage, who immediately yelled at the other that he was a bastard, and that he would never forgive him. However, Idun simply smiled sarcastically and said that was okay, before beheading our protagonist. Back to reality, the young man recalled that Idun had decapitated him at that moment, but somehow there he was, with his head still on his shoulders. He even began to wonder if all of that had been a hallucination, while looking at his reflection in a bucket of water and realizing that he was his younger self too. He even went as far as to wonder if he had been taken captive and used as a lab rat for the mages or something. That last thought pissed him off, and he thought that he would make those arrogant bastards regret having kept him alive. At that moment, our protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by another young man who entered the tent where Ghislaine was while asking the young master to come out, because he knew that our protagonist was awake. That man was a Perdium soldier called Ricardo. The soldier was caught by surprise when Ghislaine quickly appeared behind him while putting his sword against his neck, saying that he might let him leave if he answered his questions. However, the soldier's reaction was not what our protagonist had expected. Ricardo, instead of getting angry or scared, simply sighed before saying that Ghislaine was crossing the line. After all, a no was a no. Our protagonist then asked the other what he meant, and the soldier replied that the young master had tired himself out from his tantrum earlier and had fallen asleep. Those words surprised Ghislaine even more, and the soldier asked our protagonist if he had forgotten everything after taking a nap, before adding that the young master threw a tantrum about how he was going to command the group to raid the orcs. Ghislaine still didn't know what the other was talking about, but the other simply said that our protagonist should get his stuff together, because people were waiting. Our protagonist then asked where they were going, and the other immediately replied that they were going to the Perdium estate, which astonished our protagonist. After all, from his point of view, that estate had already fallen. Some time later, Ghislaine was standing atop a small hill while looking at a small town with a castle in the background, thinking that it really was the Perdium estate. He then wondered why it was fine, since he had seen it reduced to ash back then. At that moment, Ricardo got close to him and asked in a whisper if the young master had had a terrible nightmare. After all, it was a big deal calling his own household a fallen one. In fact, our protagonist would get kicked out if the Count heard that. Ghislaine then wondered if he was dreaming, but after pinching his cheek, he confirmed that that was not the case. Time after, he began to connect the dots, he being alive. A younger face, and the estate in its original state. That definitely meant that he had traveled back to the past. He then recalled that his younger self resented the household. His immaturity that had been born from feeling inferior led to trouble, and as more time passed, more people from the household avoided him. In the end, he was unable to withstand the criticism and ran away from home. Several years after that, he became a mercenary. He survived countless battles, built up his skill, and made a name for himself. Afterward, he returned to Perdium County in order to make up for his past mistakes, but his household had already been crushed to dust. He had lost everything. Nevertheless, he had received a second chance, and at that moment it was still all there. All the people he held dear were still there. He really couldn't believe it. He even thought that he wanted to sing a song in joy, but it was too early to rejoice. Ghislaine then remembered that Ricardo had said that they were there to raid the orcs, and he recalled that that day was the day most people in the raid squad would die. In his past life, he had followed the orc raid squad in an attempt to make a name for himself. At that time, the report had said there were only 3 orcs, and he had thought that would be easy enough for someone like him who had no experience commanding a squad. Unfortunately, when they got there, there were more than 20 orcs. Almost all of them ended up dying because he had been stubborn and wanted to command the squad. Back to reality, he thought that it should still be doable enough since those orcs didn't really have a strategy. The problem was if those guys would trust him, since they all thought he was some useless bastard. Nevertheless, before he could think of anything else, the orcs began their attack, surprising everybody. Even Ghislaine was surprised, and he wondered if the orcs had gotten there that fast in his past life too. Luckily, when the orcs began to kill the members of the raid squad, Skoven, their commander, yelled at them to not panic and get in a defense formation. The orcs were merciless and kept killing people, making the commander think that they had let their guard down, and that it was a dire situation, having gotten ambushed when they hadn't been prepared at all. Not to mention that there were way more of them than was reported. At that rate, they were going to die. Suddenly, someone yelled at the commander that an orc was going to attack him by surprise, but Skoven quickly realized he wouldn't be able to defend against it. Luckily, someone blocked the attack for him and pushed him away before throwing himself toward the orc. The commander then turned his head to see who had been the one who had saved him, and was surprised after realizing it had been the young master. Not only that, the commander and all the remaining members of the squad were shocked after seeing how Ghislaine killed the orc without giving it any chance to retaliate. Once he killed it, our protagonist clicked his tongue while saying that he couldn't use mana, and adding that he wished he had returned to the past earlier. Right after, he went toward the commander, who didn't know what to do, and asked him to give him the command rights. Skoven couldn't believe what the other had said. He knew that the young master was an idiot, but to ask for the right to command when the lives of their soldiers were on the line was crossing a line. Shortly after, the commander got up and replied that he couldn't do that, which surprised Ghislaine. The commander then asked our protagonist if he thought that the battle was some kind of game, before adding that even if he was the young master, he couldn't give up the authority that the Lord had given him that easily. Of course, Ghislaine thought that the commander's reaction was annoying, but he had to admit that he would have reacted the same if an idiot had asked that. Right after, the orcs resumed the attack, and Skoven told our protagonist that he should fall back because he would take care of things there. After all, Ghislaine was still too inexperienced to lead their troops. The young master then said that he had no choice and immediately thereafter threw his sword forward. The blade almost hit Scoven, but luckily he was fast enough to dodge it. However, when the commander was yelling at our protagonist for trying to kill him, he noticed that the blade had stabbed one orc in its head, insta-killing it. Scoven couldn't believe his eyes and couldn't understand how the other had hit the orc's weak spot. Shortly after, our protagonist asked the commander if he knew what was the most important thing in battle, and before the other could reply, the young master added that there was no hope in winning a battle when their troops were filled with fear, so they needed to gain momentum. Right after, he ran toward the orcs who were attacking the remaining members of the squad. Without hesitation, jumped forward and landed on one orc's back while killing it, surprising everybody. He then taunted the rest of the orcs, and they took the bait because all of them began to attack him. However, Ghislaine easily killed them one by one while Scoven wondered if he was dreaming. The commander was a mana user, but even though it was hard for him to do anything, that was why he couldn't understand how that skinny young master was doing all of that. Scoven didn't fail to notice that Ghislaine was feeling tired and knew that he was using the smallest of movements to dodge the attacks of the orcs, while using his swordsmanship to strike at their weak spots. Like a manaless sword master, he even began to think that perhaps our protagonist was something greater. As for Ghislaine, he kept taunting the orcs to get their aggro while running away from them, forcing them to chase after him. Of course, the soldiers began to think that the young master was running away, and even Scoven thought that although having run into the group of orcs to draw their attention had been good, running away afterward hadn't. However, the commander also noticed that the direction where our protagonist was going led to the edge of a cliff. Immediately thereafter, Scoven guessed the young master's intention and ordered the troops to raise a shield wall before saying, while sweating, that they would follow the first son. Back with Ghislaine, he thought that if Scoven was a skilled commander, he should have realized what our protagonist's plans were. He also thought that although he would prefer to slice all of the orcs down himself, his shitty stamina wouldn't be able to handle that. Shortly after, all the remaining orcs were cornered near the edge of the cliff, and Scoven ordered his troops to maintain their formation while pushing them off the cliff. As for our protagonist, he decided to jump off the cliff first. The next moment, all the orcs were pushed down and the soldiers realized that they had killed them. Right after, Scoven checked the cliff and saw the young master hanging thanks to having stabbed the mountain wall with his sword. Sadly, when the commander told him to grab his hand, our protagonist replied that he couldn't hold on, and right after he let go of the sword and fell. The next moment, Ghislaine was in a dark place while seeing his memories of a young girl called Elena. But before he could figure out what was happening, he suddenly woke up in a room while thinking that the soldiers had managed to save him. Nevertheless, when he tried to move, he felt his entire body hurting. After all, he had pushed his body to the limit. Shortly after, a maid entered the room and he recognized her as Belinda. She then began to scold him, saying that she had been very worried and that he should have left the soldiers to handle the orcs. However, he simply hugged her tightly, which took her by surprise. He then recalled that she was his personal tutor and the only one who had continued to stay by his side, despite his idiotic antics. Sadly, she had gone missing after the family fell to ruins. The next moment, Ghislaine told her that a catastrophe would soon strike Perdium, which astonished her. He even told her that he had died and had come back to life. But after hearing that, she dismissed his words, saying that she knew that the orcs had almost killed him. He then tried to explain himself, but she cut him off, saying that he was in greater danger at that moment before reprimanding him for all the things he had done during the fight against the orcs, which proved to him that his idea of telling her the truth wouldn't work. Belinda then asked him what he would do if he couldn't go to the festival, which shocked him. She then added that Lady Elena had been waiting for the day to go to the festival with him, which would be a great chance for the two of them to become close to each other. Afterward, our protagonist recalled that there was a festival at that time of the year, but in his past life, he hadn't had the time to enjoy it because of his traumatic experience. He then asked Belinda when would the festival begin, to which she replied that it would begin the following week. After hearing that, he realized that in a week the day that had changed his life would arrive, the day when Elena would die. At that moment, Elena entered the room, and our protagonist immediately hugged her tightly, which greatly astonished her to the point of the young lady thinking there was something wrong with Ghislaine, and that she was the victim of one of the other's pranks. However, the young master simply replied that he had missed her, which was more than what she could withstand. So she quickly pushed him away while saying that he was creeping her out. By the way, Our protagonist promptly realized that Alina was very strong because he ended up gasping for air while wondering if she had always been that strong. Alina then said that Belinda had told her to be there before asking him, while looking annoyed, what game he was playing and if he thought that gesture made everything okay. Nevertheless, our protagonist couldn't understand what she was talking about, so she had to remind him that before he had told her that he wanted her to piss off because she was annoying. He even said at that moment that just feeling her breath felt disgusting. After hearing that, Ghislaine recalled that he hadn't been the closest with Alina in his past life. In fact, he had been a complete piece of shit. He then began to scratch the back of his head and apologized to the young lady, which surprised both Alina and Belinda because they couldn't believe he had apologized first. Alina even thought that he had gotten hit in his head during the fight against the orcs. That pissed him off, and he quickly replied that he had defeated the orcs before asking why they kept implying that had been beaten. Sadly, he began to feel an intense pain that forced him to crouch, and Alina began to tease him, saying that there was no way he had defeated the orcs in that state, not to mention that he had come back unconscious. Right after, both women began to laugh while looking adorable, and he thought that everyone was as he remembered them. He then began to wonder why the past him had wasted so much time on useless things. In his previous life, he had rejected Alina's invitation to go to the festival together with a lame excuse, and that was the last time he saw her. The young lady's body was found later shredded to pieces along with her bodyguards. However, before he could think of anything else, someone knocked on the door, and right after two bodyguards, Jamal and Philip, entered the room. They then apologized for the interruption, saying that the servants had asked her to oversee their work on the festival's supplies. Shortly after, Alina left with the bodyguards, and that event made our protagonist realize that there was a shortage of workers in Perdium, something he hadn't noticed in his previous life because he hadn't cared about those things before. Ghislaine then made a decision and told Alina that he wanted to help too, which, again, astonished both ladies. Sometime later, Alina and Ghislaine were quarreling on the festival grounds outside the castle because he wanted to help and she wanted him to stay out of their way and out of trouble. After all, people didn't want to be around him. Being infamous was not easy. Nevertheless, while they were at that, Ghislaine was recalling that her body had been found near the slums, far from the festival grounds. So someone should have called her out there or forcibly moved her there. In the end, to prevent that, he needed to know the ins and outs of the castle first. At that moment, they were interrupted by an old knight called Fergus, who quickly let him know how worried he had been after knowing the incident with the orcs. Alina then took that chance to ask the old man to take our protagonist away, and Ghislaine mentally complained, because that hooligan image was getting in his way again. The young master then asked the old man to take him to an abandoned training field that was in the castle. Fergus was surprised after hearing that, but he still complied. Shortly after they arrived there, and our protagonist immediately thought that it was a perfectly suitable location for him to train. The old man then told him that he had been taking care of that place in case the young master wanted to train, because Fergus thought Ghislaine was in some kind of rebellious phase. Afterward, our protagonist asked the old man to wait outside, while thinking that he had always treated everyone around him like they were his enemies. He also recalled that back then it was revealed that the one behind Alina's death was a lord from a neighboring territory, and thanks to that Perdium got caught up in a war that led to its downfall, so it was crucial to prevent her death, and for that he needed to get a better physique. It was a shame that he didn't have enough time, but he was confident that he could at least learn to control mana in that time. Mana was a supernatural resource that allowed humans to break through their limits. Most people said that noticing and taking in the mana was the hardest part, but he was able to do it, even on the chaotic battlefield. He had to connect the mana particles floating in the air and bundle it up as if he were spinning a pool. In the end, for someone like him who had experienced tens of thousands of battles, creating a mana core was a piece of cake. However, if it was just that, he wouldn't have been part of the strongest 7 of the land. With the method from the half-burned book on magic that he had picked up and the natural mana core of humans, he could create a second and even a third mana core to build a connected mesh of multiple cores in order to create an explosive force. Sadly, after creating the third one, he began to cough blood and realized that 3 was his limit, even though he was able to reach 5 in his past life. That method allowed one to create an explosive force in a short time, but it also required an extremely large amount of mana in return. That was the primary reason why he had lost to Idun in his past life. Bringing a whole knight order to fight against him when he had run out of mana was more than he could handle. In fact, our protagonist was sure that he would have won if it had been a fair fight. Ghislaine then began to clean his mouth while thinking that it was inherently an unstable technique, but that was enough for the time being. After all, he had a youthful body and a lot of time. Before he had lost, but at that moment he decided that he would take Idun's head. Not only his head, but also the heads of those bastards standing behind House Delphine who had helped destroy their county. 1 week later, the day of the festival arrived, and Alina was surprised after seeing that Ghislaine had arrived at the festival, because he never went to those sorts of things. Our protagonist then told her that, as a Perdium, he should at least go to festivals every once in a while. Alina then looked at him suspiciously while saying that he had been acting really odd in recent times. She even had heard that he had been doing nothing but training in the last week, to which he replied by asking what was so wrong about the next, in line of a knight family training. After hearing his reply, the young lady said that he didn't care about those kinds of things before. In fact, he had even said that their dad was annoying and that he wished he was the lord already. Of course, that was a huge blow to Ghislaine, but Alina quickly added, while smiling, that she liked the way things were at that moment. It seemed that the old him was back. Our protagonist then thought that during the last week he had realized something, because his actions had changed, his reception, and the future were also slowly beginning to change. The general flow of things might be the same, but it was difficult to gauge the impact of his actions on small events. Of course, making good use of the information of the future was his job, but he still needed to respond to each situation effectively. Luckily, his preparations were complete. While he was thinking all that, Belinda was telling Elena's bodyguards to keep an eye on our protagonist, because they couldn't afford to have any problems, especially with a lot of visitors. Time passed, and Alina and Ghislaine were having fun during the festival, but eventually, she said that it was getting a little boring with it being the same every year. She even wondered if there would be something new that year. As for our protagonist, he was thinking that the festival was almost over, but nothing had happened, and he began to wonder if that was because he was with Alina. His thoughts then were cut off by one of the young lady's bodyguards, who asked Alina if he wanted to check out other areas too. The man then added that according to a friend of his, there were new events elsewhere. Of course, that piqued Elena's interest, and she quickly accepted the proposal. And the whole thing confirmed to our protagonist that the traitors of their house were precisely those two bodyguards. Elena's escort knights, Jamal and Philip, were the most trusted in the feud because they had protected Alina since she was a child. In fact, in his previous life, everybody thought that they had been murdered while protecting Alina, but the truth was that they were traitors. Some time later, they arrived at an empty zone in the slums, and Alina immediately began to ask what was that, since there was nothing there. In fact, she didn't believe a performance would happen at such a dirty place. Jamal then said that it seemed they were not prepared yet, but he was sure that people would be there soon. However, Alina still couldn't believe there was going to be a performance in that place. As for Ghislaine, he was thinking that that might seem like a simple deserted street at first sight, but looking at the placement of obstacles blocking the escape route, it was clear that the persons behind the attack had made preparations in advance. Nevertheless, his thoughts were cut off by Alina, who pulled him, saying that they should go. Right after, Jamal said that they should see the show at least, since they were there. But the young lady still refused, saying that she was not going to watch a show in a place like that. Our protagonist then asked Alina if she worked out, because she was insanely strong, but before she could reply, she bumped into Philip, who said that they should wait a little more. It was then that Alina noticed something was wrong, and she immediately asked her bodyguards what was the matter with them, because they were acting strange. Jamal then replied that he hadn't meant to scare her, but the thing was that a reasonable request had come in. Right after, 3 mysterious people arrived, and their leader said that, as expected, their work process was clean. Jamal then told the leader, whose name was Frank, that they had taken the young lady there as promised, so they should end the deal at once. However, Frank noticed that Ghislaine was there and asked if he was the eldest son of the Perdium. After all, he hadn't requested for him to be there. Jamal then replied that he would just hand him over for free. In the end, he had followed them foolishly, not knowing that would be his grave. At that moment, Ghislaine finally spoke and asked Jamal if he really thought that they could get away with it. However, Jamal simply said that the young master should start worrying about himself first. After all they had to do was run away to a faraway place. They were just getting sick of that impoverished land, tormented by the barbarians. In fact, he was sure there were plenty of others leaving Perdium besides them. Once Jamal finished that sentence, our protagonist moved like lightning and cut him in half. The bodyguard didn't even have time to blink. Of course, that astonished Philip, and even Frank changed his expression. As for the young master, he simply said that at least the others had never sold them out. Immediately thereafter, Philip took Alina hostage while saying that Jamal had been an idiot for losing to an amateur like that. The next moment, our protagonist's sword flew and stabbed the other bodyguard in his forehead killing him. After seeing that, one of the men who were with Fran asked him if he was sure that the young man was the eldest son of Perdium, and the other subordinate added that he thought that the young man had never had any real combat experience or fundamental training. Frank then replied that judging by his appearance, he was not mistaken, but he also thought that although they had been taken off guard, it was a fact that the young man in front of them had instantly killed 2 knights with attacks that used mana. Meanwhile, Alina was very scared, hugging our protagonist while asking him what was happening. Nevertheless, he immediately knocked her out while telling her that she should rest. Right after, Frank thanked him for doing the work for them. After all, they were planning on taking care of the 2 bodyguards themselves. The leader then added that Ghislaine was much different than what he had heard, and asked him if he had been hiding his true skills, to which our protagonist replied that was none of his business, while thinking that the 2 men behind Frank were nothing, but Frank himself exuded a huge amount of mana, which meant that he had to end the fight quickly. Afterward, Ghislaine grabbed his sword while asking Frank who had requested that job, but the other replied that a dead man didn't need to know that. Our protagonist then said that he knew the other wouldn't say it that easily, but he would make sure the other wanted to spill it soon enough. One of Frank's men asked him if they should sever Ghislaine's head, to which the leader replied that they should capture him alive and break every limb in his body so that he couldn't help but go mad. He had to writhe in pain for the shape to come out beautifully. Immediately thereafter, the 2 subordinates launched toward our protagonist, who threw a firecracker toward them. That made one of them get distracted, and Ghislaine insta-killed him, but the other said that had been a shallow trick and was ready to counterattack. Nevertheless, Ghislaine quickly disarmed him before cutting him in half. The next moment, Frank attacked him from behind, but Ghislaine blocked the sword blow with the sword he had taken from the second subordinate. That surprised Frank not only because the young man had managed to block his attack in that position, but also because his sneak attack had been perfect. Nevertheless, our protagonist cut off his thoughts by counterattacking. The more time passed, the more surprised Frank was, and he knew that he should get serious when one of Ghislaine's sword blows managed to cut him in the neck while also cutting his pipe. Frank then said that he was surprised and admitted that if he was lacking in mana, he would have been beheaded at that moment. As for our protagonist, he was shocked, because he couldn't understand how the other had survived a strike to his neck, although he wondered that perhaps the other had focused his mana around his neck to reduce the damage. The leader then added, while looking like a madman, that he had no clue how Ghislaine had learned such strange swordsmanship at that age, but he would still die there. The fight resumed, but Frank promptly noticed that far from being scared, tense, or nervous, our protagonist was smiling as if he was enjoying the battle, which obviously confused the leader, making him lower his guard. Ghislaine reacted like lightning after seeing that opening and almost immediately hit Frank on his head, breaking his glasses and sending him away. However, Frank regained his composure, smiled, and told the young master that he had already said he couldn't wound him with that amount of mana. Right after, he began to cough blood and feel an intense pain to the point of crouching, while wondering what had happened and why the power of Ghislaine's last attack had been so different. He couldn't believe that our protagonist had managed to pierce through his enhancement with his skill level. On the other hand, the young master slowly walked toward Frank, saying that he had never expected there was a true culprit behind Alina's death. The next moment, Ghislaine unleashed the power of his 3 mana cores while telling the other that he should prepare himself. Obviously, Frank immediately noticed the mana boost, and the leader couldn't believe how the young master had done it. Unfortunately for the leader, Ghislaine was not in the mood to explain things and quickly resumed his attacks, making Frank experience how fast the young master was. They kept exchanging blows for a while, but Frank began to look shaken. He couldn't believe what was happening. His hands were turning numb just from blocking our protagonist's strikes, and the whole situation defied logic. No matter how much mana one drew, it usually had a limited effect, and he had never heard of a method that increased mana so explosively like that. To make things worse, Frank's sword began to crack when the leader realized that Ghislaine looked like a different person. Frank's sword finally broke, and our protagonist managed to cut the other in his chest, causing a long and deep wound. However, Ghislaine was not willing to leave things like that, and right after stabbed Frank in the chest, causing the other a huge pain. Afterward, our protagonist cornered the other against the wall of one of the buildings there and told him that it was time to finish their conversation from before. The young master then asked Frank, who had been the one who had requested that job. Nevertheless, the leader wasn't planning on going down so easily, and immediately used a hidden mechanism on his wrist to shoot an arrowhead toward Alina, while thinking that he would at least take the young lady of Perdium with him. However, Ghislaine created several energy threads with his mana, not only grabbing Frank's hand, but also the arrowhead. Our protagonist then offered the other a deal. If the leader didn't try anything useless and answered his question, the young master would sheathe his sword. As for Frank, he was wondering if those threads had been created with mana, and when the young master had made them. Nevertheless, Ghislaine cut the other's thoughts, saying that he was sure someone of his caliber would know how to patch himself up, although that wouldn't matter if our protagonist destroyed his mana core. Ghislaine then began to crush Frank's mana core, making the other's mana scatter. That finally scared the leader, who asked our protagonist if he was out of his mind. After all, one wrong move, and the backflow of mana could cause an explosion and blow that whole area away. He even asked the young master if he was planning to self-destruct. However, Ghislaine simply replied that those consequences were for the unskilled, and that he could manage it. Frank then looked at how confident the young master was, and realized that the other was not bluffing, and that he was about to die. The next moment, Frank finally revealed that the one who had requested the job had been Count Desmond, who had said that he needed a pretext to start a war against the Perdium and Degard families. After hearing that, Ghislaine recalled that in his previous life, such underground work had been left for the families allied with the ducal house. He then got very angry at Duke Delphin for having orchestrated that nonsense behind the scenes. Right after, our protagonist asked if that was the reason Frank wanted to kill Alina, and the other confirmed it. The next moment, Ghislaine gave the leader the finishing blow, catching Frank by surprise. The leader even said that that had been different from what our protagonist had said earlier. Nevertheless, Ghislaine simply asked him what was the matter. After all, having killed plenty in his time, it was not fitting that he was scared when it was his turn. At that moment, Frank decided to make Ghislaine feel despair, and told him that nothing would change even if our protagonist killed him, because he had already finished the work with the Degard. The leader even asked Ghislaine if he thought people would listen to a punk like him, before adding that Perdium would perish due to the war. At that moment, Ghislaine covered Frank's mouth to cut him off, before saying that he had been reborn after dying, so everything would be different that time. Immediately thereafter, Ghislaine destroyed Frank's mana core, causing it to explode like fireworks in the sky. Right after, our protagonist sighed, but almost immediately he began to cough blood and fell on his knees due to the pain. He then cursed and said that exploding 3 cores wasn't an issue at all back when he was the mercenary king. He wasn't planning to fall like that, so he used his remaining stamina to locate a certain building, and once he went inside he found 2 bodies, while thinking that in his previous life they had found another body besides Alina at that place. So, according to what Frank had said earlier, one of those bodies should be the son of Degard, who seemed to have been killed along with his escort knight. After seeing that, it was easy to realize that that had been the way the mastermind had found to silence Degard and framed him as Alina's killer. Of course, Ghislaine was sure that the moment that was revealed the war would begin, so it was necessary to erase all the evidence. And to do that, he used his firecrackers to burn the entire place along with the bodies. Afterward, he carried Alina and left the place, thinking that he would not let things happen as the mastermind intended. What our protagonist didn't know was that, while he was leaving the place, a mysterious figure was watching him from the top of a nearby tree before disappearing without leaving a trace. Sometime later, that mysterious figure was reporting the incident to a group of people who were sitting around a round table, and after hearing the news some of them began to complain, saying that they had sent guard knights as well as Frank. They had sent the best they had. Even after going that far, they hadn't been able to even take care of just one girl. Others asked if they had let their guard down because they had thought it would be an easy job, to which the mysterious man replied, while gritting his teeth, that it had all been because of Ghislaine Perdium. That name left the people confused because it was widely known that Ghislaine was just a useless bastard of the north. In fact, one of the men said that he was sure that they were well aware that our protagonist was a useless piece of shit, so he couldn't believe that the other was using him as an excuse. Nevertheless, The mysterious man didn't back down and replied that Ghislaine was completely different from the information and rumors they had about him, while recalling all the things our protagonist had done back then. Afterward, the mysterious man added that it was as if Ghislaine was a completely different person. Finally, the mysterious man said that they had already taken care of things with Degard, so it wouldn't be an issue to start the territorial war. Right after, he asked for one more chance. Of course, that didn't please the audience. They kept complaining, saying that he should shut up. After all, they hadn't even found out enough information on one kid. Others asked the mysterious man if he realized how much of a setback that had caused. In the end, they hadn't been able to even finish an easy mission, so they couldn't believe that the mysterious man had had the guts to ask for one more chance. Most of the people present wanted the mysterious man dead. Nevertheless, at that moment, a man sitting on a throne intervened, saying that the others were being noisy. He then asked the mysterious man what kind of chance he wanted, to which the other replied, while stuttering, that he would get rid of Ghislaine Perdium. After being asked how he was planning to do that, the mysterious man replied that he would make a duel happen naturally. He even had someone in mind for that. His name was Cainloges. He was famous for his strength-based swordsmanship. Despite his young age, he was the epitome of strength. In fact, the mysterious man added that he could confidently tell them that no one in the north was a match for his strength. Not to mention that Cain was Ghislaine's cousin, so he was sure it wouldn't be forced to have them meet. After the mysterious man finished his explanation, a long and uncomfortable silence followed up until the man sitting on the throne said that if the mysterious man failed again there would be no next time, to which the other replied that he wouldn't disappoint him. Some time later, at Perdium Castle's training hall, Fergus excused himself for interrupting the young master during his training when a man of thread grabbed the sword that was beside the old knight. Fergus then witnessed how the sword flew toward our protagonist, who easily caught it before saying that that should do it. It was then that Ghislaine noticed the old man, and Fergus again apologized for interrupting before asking the young master how he had done that trick with the sword. After hearing that, Ghislaine used the threads to move the sword like a pendulum, while explaining to the old man he was using mana threads. In other words, he was using mana like a string. Ghislaine then recalled that in his past life, he used it all the time, but at his current skill level, he would need to implode his core in order to use it like he used to because he was lacking mana. However, if he used one thread to use less mana, he could still use it despite having less mana. Fergus then said that he had thought he had trained his mana for a long time, but he had never seen something like that. The old man then thought that just a while ago our protagonist didn't use mana, let alone train, so he couldn't understand how the young master had been able to come up with the idea of using mana like that. Nevertheless, the old man's thoughts were cut off by our protagonist, who asked the other what he wanted. Fergus then replied that he had just wanted to stop by to thank him for protecting the young lady. The old man even bowed while saying those words. However, that surprised Ghislaine, who replied that had been something he should have done, before adding that they should go eat. A few days passed after that. The festival was paused due to the incident with the young lady, which made sense since a guard knight had tried to traffic Elena. Speaking of the devil, Elena was very pissed, telling Ghislaine that everybody thought that she was lying when she said that our protagonist had been the one who had saved her. She even demanded him to say something to them, but Ghislaine simply replied that it was fine. Besides, they wouldn't believe them anyway. On the other hand, Belinda, who was also with them, said that Jamal and Philip had done that because they wanted the young lady for themselves. The maid was very angry, and she even added that they were bastards and that she knew they were perverts. As for our protagonist, he was just happy that Elena was alive. After all, he had been able to stop the war from happening. Nevertheless, he was sure that they wouldn't give up. Furthermore, Ghislaine was aware that he wouldn't be able to stop them on his own forever, which was why he needed to grow a military force. At that moment, a maid entered the hall carrying some food while being followed by Fergus. Our protagonist then thought that in order to grow a military force he would have to get more into politics. Nevertheless, his thoughts were cut off when he saw the meal on his plate. Ghislaine then asked Belinda why they were getting dessert first, to which the maid replied by telling him that he knew how their situation was. It was then that a scream caught them by surprise. Outside the castle, a fat man was yelling at the Perdium that they should compensate for the damages they had caused with the cancellation of the festival. In fact, he was not alone, a mob was with him, and they all were yelling that they should be compensated. Those people were armed with shovels, plows, and picks, and demanded the Perdium to go out, while saying that they should be swimming in money. The The guards tried to appease them to no avail, and right after our protagonist opened the window of the hall where he was trying to understand what was going on, Belinda then told him that she knew they would do that, which confused the young master. The maid then explained that their county was full of merchants who made a living from the profits that came from the festival. It had been good enough for them the year before. But since the festival had been cancelled after just one day, it made sense that they were upset. After hearing that, Ghislaine asked Belinda if the county's situation was that bad, while thinking that that incident was not good, because they would only get more aggressive if he didn't do anything about them. The young master then asked Fergus what the soldiers were doing before asking him to send them down to calm the crowd. Unfortunately, the old man replied that they didn't have any, which astonished our protagonist. Afterward, Fergus explained that most of the soldiers had been dispatched to the Forest of Monsters post for reconstruction because of the orc raid. When he heard that, the young master cursed mentally, because they were all there. Ghislaine then recalled that Perdium was basically eternally at war because of the barbarians to the north. Moreover, there was the Forest of Monsters from where monsters could arrive at any moment. Not to mention that since they were lacking money, he couldn't afford to recruit more soldiers, which made everything a mess. Immediately thereafter, he took Belinda apart and told her that since she was the one who managed his money, he could use that to calm down those merchants. Sadly, the maid replied that there wasn't any. Ghislaine then asked why was that, and Belinda asked him if he had forgotten that the Count had cut off his allowance because he spent money like water. Those words shocked our protagonist because it was at that moment that he realized he didn't have any money at all. The young master then asked the maid to lend him some money, but she replied that she didn't have any either. Some time later, in Ghislaine's room, he decided to sit on the windowsill, wondering that since they didn't have money or soldiers what they did have. He then thought that without even the least amount of money, there was nothing he could do, even if he knew the future, taking that into account. Before doing anything, he needed to make money. Nevertheless, before he could think of anything else, a soldier arrived looking desperate while calling him. After seeing the other's behavior, our protagonist asked him why he was in such a hurry. Right after, the newcomer, whose name was Ricardo, replied that there was a problem because young Master Cain wished to see him, which surprised Ghislaine. In the meantime, at the training hall, Cain was beating Fergus into a pulp. Luckily, our protagonist arrived before Cain killed the old man, which pleased Ghislaine's cousin.
Thanks for watching, and thanks to all of the supporters that made this video possible. If you would like to help the channel, please use the QR code in the screen. And last but not least, a super thanks to our high-ranking supporters: Arizona Gold, 1090, Fallen Stella, Joel Alvarado, Kildrak, Hitsuka, Lucifer High-Rise, Not Omega's Foot Fungus, Pawe Jajeski, and NATO Enthusiast. Thanks, and have a nice day.